the radical plan to turn a desert
They can't grow anything there.
into the promised land.
Every piece of land that we buy, we develop.
The homecoming, thousands of years in the making.
A state does not just rise in one day. It needs much preparation beforehand.
On today's 700 Club Interactive. Well, welcome to the show. Today, Theodore Herzl is known as the father of Zionism. But long before Herzl presented his plan for a Jewish state, that state was already being built. By the end of the 19th century, thousands of Jewish pioneers had returned to Palestine from Europe and Russia to carry out what they called the redemption of the land. At the Fifth Zionist Congress in 1901, Theodore Herzl directed the creation of a Jewish National Fund, or JNF, dedicated to buying land in Palestine. The Jewish people, he said, will be not only the donors, but also the owners.
The purpose of the Jewish National Fund was to purchase land in Eretz Israel and to transfer the lands into the hands of the Jewish people. This means that the JNF will be the sole owner of the lands forever.
The first step was raising money. The JNF launched a worldwide fundraising campaign. Donation cans known as blue boxes were placed in Jewish schools, synagogues, businesses, and homes.
Jews all over the world were very enthusiastic. They were excited about the idea that the Jewish people would have a property which belongs to them in the land of Israel.
The Jews often paid as much as 10 times the normal rate for land the Arabs considered unusable.
As much as they ask, we pay, because we need it. It gave us in the future the map of the future state of Israel. And every piece of land that we buy, we developed.
They dried the swamps and exploded the rocks and stones. Later on, they built drainage basins in order to drain the water, making possible for agricultural settlements to begin.
By 1914, there were nearly 100,000 Jews living in Palestine. They had started 50 agricultural villages and farmed roughly 100,000 acres of land. As the population grew, the JNF began to draw a map for the future state of Israel.
In the beginning, the purchases of lands were done according to what was available for sale. But later on, in the 1930s, it became clear that sooner or later there would be a partition of the area into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And the JNF concentrated the purchases of lands on the edges of Palestine in order to broaden the borders of the future Jewish state.
I can say that without JNF, we have no the state of Israel.
Almost 50 years before the JNF started buying land, wealthy Jewish businessmen from Europe were privately funding settlements in Palestine. One of the first was here in Jerusalem. In the mid-19th century, Jerusalem was a city marked by disease, poverty, and despair. The entire city was confined within these walls, with more than 25,000 people crowded into 1 square kilometer. In 1857, American author Herman Melville toured the city, which he described as a pile of arid rocks, where the emigrant Jews are like flies who have taken up their abode in a skull.
It was a desolate land, and the Jews, as well as the Arabs, whether they were Christians or Muslims, were living in absolute poverty.
The old city was filled with religious Jews who lived on charity. Sir Moses Montefiore, a wealthy British banker, was appalled by their living conditions and decided to help. In 1855, he had made the first Jewish land purchase in Palestine, 25 acres of orange groves in Jaffa, where Jewish settlers could be trained as farmers. Now, 5 years later, he turned his attention to Jerusalem. From the city's governor, he bought a piece of land outside the walls. Herman Melville described the transaction, saying, "They fleeced him sadly, charging enormous prices for everything he bought."
It's not that it was all built up. There was a lot of empty land, but they weren't selling to Jews. Even then, they weren't selling to Jews. So Montefiore came in and he bought land outside the wall, and he started building outside the wall. And he convinced the Jews to go and live there.
There he built a community called Mishkanot Sha'ananim, which means peaceful dwellings in Hebrew. He took the name from the words of the prophet Isaiah, "My people will dwell in a peaceful habitation, in secure dwellings, and in quiet resting places." It was the first Jewish settlement in Palestine. Jews from the old city reluctantly moved in, but sneaked back inside the city walls to sleep every night, because they were afraid of Arab marauders. Montefiore donated large sums of money to promote education among the religious Jews and to create jobs so they could support themselves. He also built a windmill to increase their food supply.
There wasn't one bakery in all of Jerusalem. If you wanted bread, you had to make it at home. Where are you going to get the flour from? There were no stores that sold flour, and there was no mill to make flour. So he built a mill.
Today, Montefiore's windmill still stands, and the village he built is now one of Jerusalem's most desirable neighborhoods, Yemen Moshe, which means the right hand of Moses. About 20 years after Montefiore's work in Jerusalem, another European banker helped build a community of Jewish farmers, this time on the shores of the Mediterranean. In 1882, 17 families from Eastern Europe founded a village on the western coast of Palestine. They called it Rishon LeZion, which means the first in Zion. The name came from a verse in the book of Isaiah. "I was the first to tell Zion, look, help is on the way." And indeed, Rishon was a city of firsts. In 1883, a young writer there wrote a poem called Hatikva, or The Hope. 65 years later, it would become the national anthem of the new state of Israel. The design for the first Israeli flag was created there in 1885. And in 1889, the first all-Hebrew school in Palestine was built. But while culture thrived, agriculture was a challenge. The settlers looked to Europe for help, and they found it in the French baron, Edmond de Rothschild.
They discovered that they can't grow anything there because it was sand dunes. Now, you can't grow apple trees and you can't grow wheat in sand. And if you planted something, even if you took a little root, the first sandstorm would kill the new plants. So eventually, Rothschild said, they're not going to succeed like that.
Baron Rothschild helped the settlers start a thriving citrus grove, where Jews and Arabs worked side by side. Then he gave them grapevines from his vineyard in France, the renowned Chateau Lafite. He also sent his own experts to supervise the growth of the new Carmel winery.
Grapevines do very, very well in sand. And so they started growing grapevines and they started making wine. And the amazing thing was that the wine was Rothschild wine from Rothschild vines. And it became very, very good wine. You see, so all of a sudden, they had their first success.
Just 18 years after the first vine took root, Carmel wine won a gold medal at the Paris World's Fair. Today, Rishon LeZion is the fourth largest city in Israel, and Carmel wine is sold in more than 40 countries around the world. Baron Rothschild once said of the project, "Without me, the Zionists could have done nothing. But without the Zionists, my work would have been dead." Just north of Rishon LeZion, another city was rising on the dunes of the Mediterranean. It would later become the center for Israeli innovation and the first modern city of the new Jewish state. In 1906, Jewish settlers purchased 60 plots of land on the Mediterranean coast, just north of the Arab city of Jaffa. 3 years later, in 1909, 66 Jewish families gathered on a sand dune to divide the land, using a lottery of seashells. Family names and plot numbers were written on the shells and drawn randomly from a box. This gathering was the official birth of the city of Tel Aviv. The city took its name from the Hebrew title of Theodore Herzl's book, Old New Land. The spot where the settlers stood would later be the site of the Tel Aviv Museum, where almost 50 years later, the Jewish people would declare their independence.
The JNF gave the largest loan to the founders of Tel Aviv. After that, the Tel Aviv founders were able to purchase land and build houses. The JNF was one of the most important institutions in building and preparing the nation for the founding of the state. A state does not just rise in one day. It needs much preparation beforehand.
Whether the land of Israel was purchased by wealthy patrons or bought with small donations from around the world, many Jewish people believe their ownership of the land is secured by a deed written thousands of years ago.
Our Bible is our deed for our ownership of this land. And the idea of the JNF came from the Bible. The land of Israel belongs to the God. Zionism was the Jewish national movement. A Jewish national movement without strong roots to the Bible can't exist.
Well, over the next few days, we'll be showing more stories like this about the founding of the State of Israel. Tomorrow, we'll have the story of Chaim Weizmann, the chemist who became the first president of Israel. Well, if you miss an episode or you want to see a story again, all you have to do is go to 700clubinteractive.com, and we'll have all the stories on there. Once they're broadcast, you can go back and see them. And if you want to get the full DVD documentary on the series, we have it both in DVD format and in Blu-ray format. You get to pick which one you want, depending on the equipment you have at home. All you have to do is call us, 888-777-1999, if you'd like to get that. It's for a gift of donation of $10 or more. We'll send it out to you. You can also order online by just going to 700clubinteractive.com. Well, still ahead, there's a dangerous trend toward anti-Israel sentiment in the church. Joel Richardson joins us to explain. Stay with us. Joel Richardson is an outspoken voice urging Christians to support Israel, and he joins us now. And Joel, welcome to the show.
Gordon, good to be with you.
What do you say about the current movement to boycott, divest, sanction Israel? Why is that? Why are Christians turning to that? It seems astounding to me, but why are they doing it?
You know, the boycott, divestment, sanctions is a movement that began with, rabid, racist, pro-Palestinian activists, but they have couched it as this sort of grassroots college movement that's founded on justice and compassion. And they've done a really good job with the propaganda narrative, and so a lot of these young Christians, they think they're getting involved. The Lord cares about justice and compassion, but they've really perverted those values. And as a result of that, you've got a lot of Christians that are putting their boats, if you will, into this river, which ultimately leads to the nation of Israel being surrounded by nations which want to destroy her. And that's literally what it's leading to.
Well, I see it as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. What I don't understand is how can the very elect be deceived by it? And I'm seeing even denominations get on board and saying our pension funds, our investments aren't going to be in Israel. Is there a theological underpinning to it? And what do you call that?
Absolutely. I mean, and this is the thing, is to say, how could Christians get involved in something which is so contrary to the Word of God and the heart of God? But when you look at the history of the Christian church, overwhelmingly, the church taught replacement theology. It's this idea that the church has replaced Israel and God is done with Israel. He's dissolving the people of Israel. So once you begin with that theology, then the fact that Israel is a nation, reestablished, prospering, it becomes a huge thorn in the side of your theology. And so rather than, essentially they're forced to sort of undermine Israel politically. And so it's political criticism and undermining of Israel is a way to support their flawed theology.
Well, let's turn to the Bible. I mean, you've got a wonderful book out, When a Jew Rules the World, where you do just that. I joke that the longer I'm a Christian, the more Jewish I become. And I really understand what Paul was talking about, the one new man, and how the Gentiles are literally grafted into the tree of Judaism. For me, growing up, and I grew up Baptist, we tried to make a lot out of, the Gospel of Luke as, here's the one Gentile. And even that now turns out in my research, that's not even true, that he probably was Jewish. And so when you look at the New Testament, even in that, all the authors are Jewish. And you just, for me, now I can't get away from it, but we seem to have gotten away from that.
This was the biggest warning that Paul the Apostle made to Gentile believers. He said, listen, you guys, know your place. He says, before you were introduced to the God of Israel, to Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua, you were a Gentile, you were a pagan, you were without hope, without God in the world. And this was our place. And then he says, but now by grace you've been grafted in, as you said, to the tree of Israel. And he says, but just because you've been grafted in by grace, don't you become arrogant. Don't you look down on those that were broken off in order that you blind Gentile could come in. And yet, unfortunately, Gentile arrogance is what has dominated much of the church down through history. And there's this great movement in the late 1800s or early 1800s, the Plymouth Brethren movement, and that's changed the face of the theological face of the church. And much of the church now supports Israel, stands with Israel, understands the ongoing calling and election of Israel. But now, in recent years, there's been this trend back to embrace replacement theology, and it's a dangerous trend, and it needs to be confronted vigorously.
Well, what was it about America? Because you look at the history of that, it's primarily American voices. Ezra Stiles, even one of the ancestors of the Bushes, was writing about the restoration of Israel. And only through the restoration of a Jewish nation in Israel could you see actual fulfillment of the biblical prophecies. What was it about America that allowed that?
The United States was founded, people say it was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and that's true in a general sense. And then you could say, and even more specifically, it was founded on Christian principles. But ultimately, in the most specific sense, it was founded on Protestant Christian principles. It really was. And so with this movement in the early 1800s, the Plymouth Brethren movement, there was a return to embrace a more literal face value, hermeneutic approach to interpreting the scriptures. Once you read the Bible for what it says, then it becomes clear that in the last days, Israel would be reestablished in the land as a nation. You had numerous guys back then that saw it, declared that it would happen hundreds of years before it happened. And it has happened. And they weren't prophets. They were simply reading the scriptures.
What can Christians do to get more involved in this? It's one thing to be informed, but when you see the boycott, divestment, sanctions going on, what should you do?
Well, we need to resist it. And, when it's creeping into the denominations, as it has, we've seen some of the major denominations, putting out statements that are vehemently anti-Israel. I mean, that are really almost fomenting people to violence, some of it. I mean, it's really gross stuff. And I won't say which denominations, but when you see these things creeping in, if you're part of a denomination, then stand against it. Politically, stand against it. There are groups that are engaged in that political activism side of things. But and that's important. But let me just say this, that beyond the political activism side, first and foremost, our stand with Israel has to be gospel-centered. So we need to stand against the propaganda and the lies that are coming against Israel. But at the heart of it, our support has to be much deeper and spiritual. We need to be calling the Jewish people back to the God of Israel, back to their Messiah. It's the Jewish Messiah that brought us into this relationship with them, and that's our duty. It's our mandate is to bring them back to Him as well.
What would you say to people, and I've actually heard this, who understand biblical prophecy, understand the importance of Israel in fulfillment, but at the same time say, let this other thing happen because that's prophesied as well. At one point, all the nations are going to gather, so let them do it. Why hinder it?
Right. Yeah. Fatalism is the greatest pitfall of those that study biblical prophecy. The Lord wants us to, there are certain things that will take place, but He doesn't want us to participate and to capitulate, and He doesn't want us to sit back and passively allow it to happen. Because this is sort of that weird dimension where is it Satan or is it God? Well, Satan will stir up the nations against Israel, and the Lord will allow it to happen. But we are to resist it. We have to stand against the activity of Satan. And so, sort of this passivity, well, the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket. Why polish the brass on a sinking ship? Why bother? In my opinion, the Lord will judge those who take that passive attitude. He wants us engaged, and He wants us on His side. His ultimate purpose is redemption, not destruction.
Yeah, their blood will be on our hands if we don't warn them of the coming destruction.
Right.
And don't warn them that they're in danger of being cut off if they go along with this.
Right. Yep.
Well, thank you for the book. Thank you for the wisdom. Thanks for the insight. If you want to know more about this, when a Jew rules the world, how to interpret biblical prophecy, how to really understand what the Bible says about Israel and the plan of God, this book is available wherever books are sold. We'll be back with more of 700 Club Interactive right after this. Well, this is 700 Club Interactive, where we interact with you, and we've already got a question in on this from Stephen, and he asks, what exactly is a Gentile, and what does it mean to be grafted in? I've heard my pastor say that phrase, and I don't get it. Well, I just used it in the interview with Joel. First, what's a Gentile? The very simple explanation, it means you're not Jewish. In Hebrew, it's the Goyim, and it's loosely translated the nations. In Greek and Latin, it became Gentile. And the Gentile nations are all the nations of the world who aren't Jewish. So you're outside the covenant. And there's two covenants specifically for this. One is the covenant with Abraham, and the second is the covenant of Mount Sinai, the covenant of the Torah, that if you observe the Torah, God will bless you. If you're a descendant of Abraham, God will bless you. He will bless those who bless you. He will curse those who curse you. So those are the covenants available, and you have to be Jewish to enter into those covenants. Now, the Apostle Paul made a wonderful word picture that we're grafted in to that olive. And he says, the Gentiles are the wild olives, and only the Jewish people are the domesticated olives. Those are the olives that bear fruit. And so we're grafted in to that olive tree. And it's a word picture from horticulture, where you can take the limb of another tree and graft it into a tree, and it will start growing, and it will draw in the sap from the root of that new tree. And what he's saying is the wild Gentiles are now grafted into the root of Judaism, and we get to enjoy the blessings of Abraham. We get to enjoy the blessings of being grafted in. So that's what it means. Well, if you want to get informed, I want you to have this. It's called The Hope, The Rebirth of Israel. It's a wonderful DVD. It's yours for a gift of $10. So call us, 888-777-1999. We leave you this word from Psalm 9. I will praise you, O Lord, with my whole heart. I will tell of all your marvelous works. Tune in tomorrow for more of The Hope, The Rebirth of Israel.